Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our discussion of the Protestant Reformation. Right now, we spent a lot of time in class actually talking about the growth of the Protestant Reformation now in England, right? We talked all about Luther and his phase in the Holy Roman Empire, and now we're discussing the growth of Henry VIII and his Protestant church known as the Church of England, right? So something that we need to make sure that we understand is that is very important, right? The idea that he is now creating a Protestant nation state inside of England, right? So we're seeing Protestantism grow, and it's growing very rapidly, right? It's growing very rapidly. It's going to spread to Switzerland. It's then going to spread back to England. It's then going to keep kind of having like a big war that's going to go on in England as well. We're also going to talk today in this flip about why Bloody Mary is known as Bloody Mary, right? So the big thing about it, though, that you need to understand is I am just simply introducing this flip. Make sure you pay very special attention. I'm going to be clipping in a flip from last year because as many of you got to meet my brother, he is in town, right? Y'all, a lot of y'all, my S period definitely got to meet John and stuff like that. Now, we're very, very kind to him, and I really, really appreciate that, right? So, but we're going to go hang out. We're going to go do some stuff and things like that, so I appreciate y'all's understanding, but make sure you pay attention to this flip really well, and I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. Gives birth to a girl, and that girl's name is Elizabeth, right? So Henry has now had 2 wives and 2 daughters, right? He still has the same issue. And it's because we believe, genetically speaking, that it was not his wife's fault, right? He thinks in his mind that it's his wife's fault for not producing heirs. But genetically speaking, it's his chromosomal makeup that is messing everything up. It is not the oven that's the problem, okay? Everything else is the problem, okay? So the big thing getting into it, going forward, is you also have to understand is as of 1534, once he married his wife, right around when Elizabeth gets born, he passes another act through Parliament. This parliamentary act is called the Act of Supremacy. This required, now this is really important, the fallout of this is very important. How this moves forward, the story forward is very important. The Act of Supremacy is an act that required the subjects of England to take an oath declaring that Henry is the supreme head of the church, that they will follow no pope before him. And this completely breaks England away from the Holy Roman Catholic Church, right? You are no longer allowed to practice Catholicism in public. You are no longer allowed to advocate for Catholicism over the Anglican Church. So basically, he kind of outlawed Catholicism in England in totality. Some of his advisors even said, hey man, this is not a good idea. Maybe you shouldn't do this. And one of them, his name was Sir Thomas More, who wrote one of the famous books in all of history known as the Utopia. And Sir Thomas More ends up losing his head and getting his head chopped off, right? And Anne Boleyn, later on, after this act of supremacy, though, Henry says, oh, no boy, guess what? We're not going to be married anymore. So he tries to annul his marriage to Anne Boleyn. But then Anne refuses to allow it. She's like, we're still together. We are not getting a divorce, right? So what ends up happening, though, is he has her charged with incest because of rumors that are swirling around court, witchcraft, which is why there's a picture of her in the first Harry Potter movie, and then also adultery. And she ends up getting beheaded. And apparently at her execution, when the head came off her shoulders and fell onto the gallows, it rolled over and then went and apparently tried to talk and the mouth was still moving. And so it's a big whole thing, like Anne Boleyn's talking head was like a really, really big deal. But then he goes off and gets married to another woman, right? And so just really, really quickly, in total, he had 6 wives, right? And here's how they go. Say it with me really quick. Jot this down somewhere. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived, right? So say it with me again. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That's the order that the wives go in, right? And so he ends up getting married to this one that's going to die, and her name is Jane Seymour. Now, Jane Seymour is his 3rd wife. He and her conceive a child, and guess what? They finally have a boy, right? And what a weird-looking boy he is, right? That is Edward VI, right? So Edward, when he becomes king, he's going to be a very, very young man. He's going to be about 9 years old. And the biggest thing about him is, as you can tell by looking at him, he was a very sickly kid, right? When he was born, his father was so excited because he was like, my son, he's going to take over for me. The Tudors will reign supreme. Rah! So, but the biggest thing that happens is Edward is a very, very sick kid. He almost dies multiple times in infancy. And the other big problem that ends up happening is Jane Seymour, his mom, dies in childbirth, right? So Edward lives, Jane dies, and then Henry goes on to have 3 more wives, right? Number 5 also gets beheaded as well for cheating on him and stuff like that. But Anne of Cleves, they're not even technically really married. They're only married for like a few hours. And then the last one, Catherine Parr, she just happens to not die, right? She just gets married as his 6th wife, and then he ends up dying later on, right? So the thing about it, though, is his son, Edward, when he takes over at 9 years old, would only rule for about 6 years, like sort of, kind of. There's a lot of weird stuff about Edward. Like he almost married a 7-month-old kid, and that kid's name was Mary Queen of Scots, who was also his cousin, which is another whole thing. But when he was like 6 months, or when that child was 6 months old, he was 4. And it's like this whole other weird thing. But notice I said he only ruled for about 6 years. So what happened to him when he was 15? When he was 15, he died from a disease known as tuberculosis, right? So he dies from tuberculosis at the age of 15, and then he ends up having to relinquish control to his sisters, right? So what ended up happening is in 1543, after Edward's birth, Henry VIII passed another act. This act was called the Third Succession Act of 1543. And the Third Succession Act of 1543 set it up so Elizabeth, or AKA Henry's daughters, could take the throne after his death. Now, the thing about it, though, this was just to keep the Tudors going, but everybody kind of expected that maybe Mary would already be dead. But guess what? She wasn't. Edward tried to prevent Mary from being able to take over because everyone knows that Mary is a fierce Catholic, ferociously hates her father Henry and all this other stuff. And he tries to prevent his sister from getting the throne, but he fails miserably. He actually tried to give it to his other cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who was only queen for like 9 days, and then she ends up getting beheaded too. Now, Mary becomes Queen of England, returns England to Catholicism, banishes the Anglican Church, and even burns people at the stake for not going back to being Catholic, right? So she earns herself the nickname Bloody Mary, right? Yes, Bloody Mary is a real person, right? So Bloody Mary is a very real person. She ended up apparently burning something like 300 people at the stake. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? And Elizabeth, though, later on is going to become queen because Mary would die. Because when she took over, she was 37 years old, which is very old for a role to be taken over at this time. She ends up taking over. She only rules for about 5 or 6 years. She ends up dying in her early 40s. And then her sister, Elizabeth, becomes queen. And Elizabeth is going to be very important that we bring up in another unit. We talk much more about her story a little bit later on when she becomes queen and she splits English government away from the church. It's supposed to say English government, right? So like she basically takes the crown and the church and tries to separate them and be like, look, here is our state, here is our church. Let's keep them from mixing and miring together, right? So now the big thing is we got a little bit more to talk about and then we're going to be done. We got one other major reformer, right? The other major reformer is a guy by the name of John Calvin, right? So John Calvin is going to be a major reformer that shows up out of France, right? And he's going to also exist a little bit later in time, right? So when Elizabeth takes over, it's about 1550. Now, Calvin was already active by this point, right? So Calvin is originally from France. And John Calvin had originally already been stirring the pot in France a little bit. He had started talking about how immorality is going to lead to corruption and how all this disgusting things that the French were into were going to lead to corruption and how basically the Christian soul is an immutable thing that has to follow a strict moral code to be able to achieve heaven and God knows about us all, da-da-da-da. And so all the French people were like, dude, this guy's talking a lot of crazy stuff, right? And the French king himself, Francis I, even heard about this guy. Francis I is the same king that Henry VIII challenged to a wrestling match and that Henry VIII lost to. Now, John Calvin, though, ends up being exiled to Switzerland and he runs away under threat of arrest and execution because apparently one night in France, posters got put up all over the place that said, Francis is the devil, the Catholics are the bad people, blah, 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 blah. It's called the Affair of the Placards, right? But to avoid being arrested, John Calvin runs away to Switzerland. And in Switzerland, he goes to the city of Geneva, and he starts a new type of faith called Calvinism, right? And Calvinism hinges on 2 very specific things: predestination and a strict moral code, right? So let's chat about that really, really quick. Predestination is that God knows where you're going to go, if you're going to go to heaven or hell before you're even born. He knows the entire play out of time. He knows how everything is going to work. And he also thinks that only certain people are going to heaven and that the number of the saved is very, very tiny, whereas the number of the people that are going to hell is very, very large, right? And so because of this, John Calvin believes that his new faith, Calvinism, are the people that are chosen to go to heaven. And he thinks that they need to follow these super strict moral regulations to be able to achieve divine sanctuary and divine, what's the word I'm looking for? Divine saving? Be able to achieve God's kingdom, right? And so according to Calvin, church attendance is required. Now, next to strict moral code, write a couple of these things down. In Calvinist communities, the following things were illegal because they distract from God and our predestination, right? Games of any type, playing cards, alcohol, singing in public, dancing in public, bright colored clothing, anything ostentatious, toys for children. Halloween is banned in Calvinist communities, and even gift giving on Christmas is not allowed in Calvinist communities. So as you can tell, the Calvinists are very, very strict. And you also know a couple of Calvinists that you don't even realize that you know. For example, the Puritans, aka the Pilgrims, were Calvinists, right? They're a type of Calvinist, and that's why they wore black and white all the time. And it's also why they were super, super rude to women and stuff. And it's also why they led their witch hunts and things like that, because Protestants were much more popular for doing witch hunts than the Catholics were, right? So but that is where we're going to stop right there. We are going to pick up on our art presentations in our next class. We're going to wrap those up, and then we're going to finish up the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and then we're going to just be done, all right? So, good job, y'all. Keep killing it. Very proud of y'all. I'll see y'all soon.